Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to watch video 1, which was how do I change decimals to fractions. What we're going to look at now is finding the equivalence by going from fractions back to decimals. They are equivalents. We're really talking about two numbers that share the same value. They're just two different ways of writing them. If you're not sure what a fraction or a decimal is, you may want to go back to some of my earlier videos. There was one earlier about what a fraction means, and if you need to go back to that at this point, feel free. I'm going to go on assuming you already have, though. All right, starting with 3/10. If I have a fraction like 3/10, notice in the denominator, that bottom number, I'm already in tenths. And if you remember from the last video, we said to the right of the decimal point, you have the tenths place, the hundredths place, and the thousandths place, and it continues counting by powers of 10 after that. 3/10 simply means I'm putting the number 3 in the tenths place. I have an object that's been divided into 10 parts. You're going to get 3 of them. So if we wrote that, we would write that as 0 whole numbers and 3/10 of an object. There's nothing here because, as we know, this is the ones place, and we said there was no whole number here. You see no whole number right here. The ones place and then the tenths place. 3 is in the tenths place, 3/10. Same thing would happen with 4 if it were in the tenths place. 4/10, 4/10, decimal point 4. You'll notice here I used the 0 and here I did not. And neither is really wrong. You will usually see on a calculator the 0 there to hold that ones place, just to say there was no whole number. If I have a larger number, like 35 hundredths, I would represent it here as decimal 35. 35. Because remember we said in the last video, it has a lot to do with how you read these numbers. I read the whole number as one large number first, then I tell you what the place value is of the very last digit of that number. So with 35, you will notice the 5 is in the hundredths place. There's the tenths, there's the hundredths. 35 hundredths. 35 out of 100 pieces. Okay? The nice thing about fraction to decimal is once you get that number in the tenths, the hundredths, or the thousandths, you can just write it as the decimal. It falls in place very well if you keep the rules in mind. The hard part with fractions is when you get a fraction that is not tenths, hundredths, or thousandths, or so on, 10 thousandths and on. If that happens, you have really two options, and really I'm only going to talk about one of them since this video is meant for my 5th graders. Option number 1 is you're going to have to find an equivalent fraction for your denominator, for that fraction you were given, that will allow your denominator to become a 10, a 100, or a 1,000. All right? If you're not sure what an equivalent fraction is, you may want to go back to my earlier video. I did one on equivalence already. But I'm going to assume at this point you've already seen that or you've worked with it already. There is another way to convert fractions to decimals for denominators that will not be factors of 10, 100, or 1,000. But that's not a 5th grade standard, so we're not going to go over that. I don't want to confuse the kids. For right now, we're just going to look at if I'm given a fraction that has a denominator that is a factor of 10, 100, or 1,000, how do I make that conversion? And then what is it going to look like as a decimal? So now the fun begins, because now we're going to look at some fractions that do not have 10, 100, or 1,000 as their denominator. So really simple. Let's start with the most common benchmark of all fractions, 1/2. Can I write 1/2 as a decimal? Well, the problem is right now that's a 2 in the denominator. We said tenths, hundredths, thousandths. To the right of that decimal, I'm supposed to have fractions that look like this. Let me just put it down for you. They should look like this. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths. But this right here is a 2. So we need to find the equivalent fraction. I have to now ask myself, is there a number I can divide 1/2 up into? In other words, I'm taking the object that I cut in half and I'm dividing it up into more parts that will allow me to get 10, 100, or 1,000 parts. Well, if I divide it into 5 parts per piece, so in other words, I'm dividing it into fifths, I can do this because if I multiply 2 times 5, 2 times 5 is 10. So what I'm really doing is I'm saying, okay, the only way I can change 1/2 into a decimal is to find an equivalent fraction for 1/2 where tenths, 100ths, or 1,000ths are the denominators. By multiplying it by 5, in other words, I've taken the object and I said, I'm going to multiply the parts by 5. I'm going to cut them up into smaller parts. I get as a final fraction 5 tenths. Because remember, in an earlier video we talked about this. When I divide up all the objects, I'm not only dividing up the parts I'm not using, I'm also dividing up the parts I am using. So this is 5 tenths. So if I look now at my decimal here, there's my tenths place. That's where the 5 is going to end. Because remember we said, the last number you say, that's the place value, 5 tenths. Well, 5 tenths then, of course, is going to go right over top the tenths place. It will be written just like, whoops, go this way, just like so, 5 tenths. So if I say 5 tenths as a decimal, what I'm really saying is 1/2 as a fraction. Let's try one a little odder than that. Let's try something fourths. And I have a little visitor at my feet right now, so don't mind the jingling. He's just checking out the floor. Go lay down, Alex. He's ignoring us. What if I'm given the fraction 3/4? 4. Let's count by 4s. 4, 8, 12. 4 doesn't go into tenths. Will 4 go into 100? Well, yes, it will, actually. If you think about your money, how many quarters does it take to get a dollar bill? 100 cents. It takes 25 cents, or 4 quarters. So I'm going to multiply 3/4, the denominator and the numerator, by 25. 3 times 25 and 4 times 25 gives me 75 hundredths, which as a decimal, 75, so I read the whole number, hundredths place is the second spot. That works well because I have 2 digits in this case. And I get 75 hundredths. It'll look just like this. All right? We're going to take a pause for a moment because the dog is insisting on a drink of water. I will be right back.